And we're back. Hello! This week we're making cheesecake. My mom's birthday is coming up this weekend and I volunteered to bake dessert, of course. So she requested lemon raspberry cheesecake, which we're making today. Let's go. First we're going to do some prep and make the raspberry puree we'll use in the cheesecake later. I simply blended roughly 160 grams of raspberries with 2 tablespoons of sugar until smooth, and then strained out the seeds with a fine mesh strainer. You could easily cut these measurements in half and still have plenty for the cheesecake though. I ended up using this on the top of the cake to make raspberry cream cheese frosting, and I still had some left over. If your berries aren't super juicy and it's having issues blending up, you can add a splash or 2 of water to help it along. Next, we'll prep the graham cracker crust by crushing up a package of graham crackers and coating with 2 tablespoons of melted butter before pressing into the pan we'll be baking the cheesecake in. The pan we'll be baking the cheesecake in is called a spring-formed pan. It has a mechanism on the side that tightens and loosens the wall of the pan and fully releases the walls of the pan from the bottom so that the cake is supported while baking and chilling, but the walls of the pan can be removed when you're ready to serve the cake. Make sure to butter or spray the sides and the bottom of the pan with nonstick spray so the cake will release from the pan once it's baked before you put the graham cracker crust in there. I wanted a nice even layer of crust at the bottom, so I pressed it down firmly with the bottom of a glass. Now for the actual cheesecake part of this cheesecake. Firstly, and most importantly, if you intend on making cheesecake and you take anything away from this video, please know that cheesecake is extremely temperature sensitive from beginning to end. Ensuring that all your ingredients are at room temperature before mixing anything will get you off on the right foot to make a creamy cheesecake. I prefer to pre-measure all of my ingredients that I would normally be grabbing from the fridge so that I'm not leaving the entire container of heavy cream out on the counter, or the whole carton of eggs on the counter, or the whole container of sour cream just for the little bit that I'm going to use in the cake to come to room temperature. Plus, it makes it easier later on when you're mixing so you don't have to measure because you already did. To start, we'll whip 2 pounds, yes, I said 2 pounds, of cream cheese slowly until fluffed and smooth. Then we'll slowly add 166 grams of sugar and 4 eggs one at a time, mixing well between additions. Scrape down the bowl as needed. And if you're using a KitchenAid, don't forget the little bump that's in the bottom of the bowl. Sometimes stuff gets stuck there, so make sure you scrape that away too. Then add 50 ml or a quarter cup of heavy cream and 60 grams or a quarter cup of sour cream. The zest of 1 lemon and 1 tablespoon of fresh lemon juice. Mix on low speed just until everything is combined before pouring into the prepared pan with the graham cracker crust. As I mentioned earlier, cheesecake is very temperature sensitive, so we'll be baking it low and slow at 325 degrees. We'll also use a water bath, also called a bain-marie. What we're going to do is set the cheesecake pan into another pan partially filled with water to help it cook evenly. But we don't want any of the water seeping through and making our cheesecake soggy. To prevent the water from getting into our pan and into our cheesecake, we'll cover the cheesecake pan bottom and sides with large heavy-duty foil. Make sure you get a nice snug fit with no tears and all the way up the sides of the pan. Select a pan that fits your cheesecake pan inside of it. Most of the time this will be a roasting pan, but I used a large oven-safe skillet. Anything that fits your cheesecake pan inside will do. And now for the raspberry puree. This will also be part of the decoration at the end of baking, which I like to keep simple but done well, so I went with a simple marble design. You can get as fancy and creative as you want with this part. But to do the marble design, drip small dots of the puree on the top of the cheesecake batter and then swirl lightly with a toothpick or chopstick to your liking. I intended to add some frosting around the edges once it's baked, so I deliberately left an empty ring along the outside. With the oven preheated to 325 degrees and our bain-marie prepared, we'll set the whole contraption in the oven and pour boiling water into the larger pan until the water is about halfway up the sides of the cheesecake pan. A tea kettle makes this particularly easy. Be very careful when you're pouring not to splash any of the water on the cheesecake. Using a bain-marie will help the cake bake evenly and add moisture to the heated environment in the oven that will prevent any cracks in the top of the cake. Be very gentle pushing it back into the oven at this point because it's still very liquidy and you don't want to ruin your design on top or splash cheesecake everywhere. Once everything is set, allow it to bake for 60 minutes. At this stage, we don't simply want to take the cake out of the oven. Remember, it's very temperature sensitive, so coming out of a 325 degree oven straight to room temperature is too much of a temperature shock for it. It needs to cool down very, very slowly and gently. Just turn the oven off and prop it open using a wooden spoon or another kitchen utensil so that it's cracked open a few inches and will vent to cool slowly. Leave the cake in the oven to cool like this for another 60 minutes. Once it's had a chance to cool off completely in the oven, you can remove it and let it rest at room temperature and remove it from the water bath. The sides of the cake should be fairly solid and the middle have a slight wobble when lightly jostled. Usually baked goods having a wobble in the center is an indicator they're not baked all the way through, but in the case of cheesecake, a slight wobble is a good thing. After the cake is cooled to room temperature, allow it to chill and solidify in the fridge overnight before decorating. Next is the fun part, decorating. I wanted to use up some of the extra raspberry puree, as I mentioned earlier, so I decided to whip up some raspberry cream cheese frosting. For this, I whipped 4 ounces of softened cream cheese, a 1/4 cup of powdered sugar, a tablespoon of the raspberry puree, and a drop or 2 of heavy cream, you can also use milk, to thin it out a little bit. I was intending to pipe the frosting into little stars around the outside of the cake, so I needed the consistency of the frosting that would hold its shape. The basic rule of thumb for frosting is if it's too thin, add powdered sugar. If it's too thick, add heavy cream or milk to thin it out. And just keep mixing and adjusting until you get the consistency you're going for, depending on what you're using it for. Adding something like raspberry puree is also a great way to give it a pretty pink color without using food coloring. If you're transferring to a piping bag to create designs on a cake, use a glass. You'll be able to transfer the frosting without needing someone to hold the bag for you, and if the frosting spills out of the tip of the bag, it'll go into the glass instead of on the counter. I don't use piping bags often, but I prefer reusable ones so I'm not wasting plastic. I piped on some stars around the outside of the cake and then added some fresh raspberries and mint leaves for decoration. And with that, the cake is done. Well, this cake turned out great. I took it to mom's birthday and it was delicious. I particularly love I brought a piece home. I particularly like the raspberry cream cheese frosting that I made. It is so tangy. Like my mouth's watering thinking about it. I really like it. It's really good. I told my husband now I have the idea to add the raspberry puree to some coconut whipped cream. I don't know what to put it on yet, but he said just eat it with a spoon. Maybe I'll do that. This cake turned out really good. It was super smooth and creamy. There were a couple cracks on the top, but I think it's because when I was using the chopstick to create the little swirls or like the design on top, I pushed down too much. The other part that I would recommend being really thorough with is when you rub the pan, especially on the sides, with butter, because when I unhinged the pan and loosened it and it was coming out, a couple of spots like stuck to the sides of the pan, and then it started like peeling it apart basically. So I had to do it really slowly, really carefully, and get a little rubber spatula in there to like help it loosen away from the sides. So make sure that you spray your pan or use the butter thoroughly so that it'll come off, like release from the pan when you're ready to eat it. I mean, there's room for improvement, definitely. But what I was mainly concerned with making this is the consistency and like fluffy, creamy texture of the cream cheese, like the cheesecake itself. Oh, and the lemon flavor is so good. It's so tangy. If you like this video or you learned something, give it a like. If you'd like to learn more, subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.